The phone rang at 11:58 on a Thursday night in October. I know the exact time because the old clock on my nightstand glows green in the dark, and I had been lying there for the better part of an hour, unable to sleep. At 74 years old, sleep does not always come when you call it. Sometimes it circles you like a hawk, close enough to feel the shadow of its wings, but never quite landing. I reached for the phone without sitting up. My right hand knew where it was. 46 years of pastoral work will train a man to answer the phone at any hour without panic. Somebody's mother has passed. Somebody's marriage is coming apart at the seams. Somebody needs a voice in the dark. That is what a shepherd does. The name on the screen read Terrence. My son. I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear. Before I could say a word, his voice came through like a man running from something he could not outrun. Dad. Dad, you have to listen to me right now. The church is on fire. I sat up slowly. The old bed springs groaned beneath me, the way they had groaned for 30 years, since Gloria and I bought this mattress at the Sears on Summer Avenue. I reached over and turned on the lamp. The room filled with soft yellow light. Terrence, I said, slow down. There is no time to slow down. Dad. I got a call from the alarm company 20 minutes ago. The whole East Wing is engulfed. The fire department is on the way, but the damage is already severe. The sprinkler system failed. We need an emergency contractor on site tonight, and they require $25,000 before they will mobilize. I need you to wire the money. Please. Right now. I did not answer right away. I have been a preacher for a long time. Long enough to know that panic has a particular sound. A high, breathless quality that shakes a man's voice. Terrence sounded panicked. No question. But there was something else underneath. Something that did not sit right with me, the way a warped floorboard does not sit right under your foot. I listened past his words to the background behind them. In a real emergency, there is never silence. There are sirens and the roar of water hitting hot wood. There are voices cutting over each other and the wail of smoke alarms nobody has thought to silence. I know these sounds. I have stood at enough scenes of grief to know what real disaster sounds like. Behind my son's voice, there was nothing. Just a hollow, still quiet. The kind that lives inside a parked car or a closed room. Where are you standing right now? I asked. In the parking lot. I can see the flames from here. Please, Dad, there is no time. You have the emergency fund. $25,000. Please. I got up from the bed and walked to the window. Outside, the October rain was coming down in long, thin sheets, slanting through the streetlight on the corner. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass and looked out at the quiet street. I will come down there myself, I said. Dad, there is no need. Just wire the money. I can handle everything from here. I am coming down, Terrence. Sit tight. He said something else, but I had already set the phone down on the dresser. I pulled on my flannel shirt and my work pants. I laced my boots the way I always have, left foot first, the way my father taught me in a small kitchen in Clarksdale 60 years ago. I took my raincoat from the hook by the door and put on my glasses. Before I left the room, I stopped at the dresser. There is a coffee mug that sits there always. Gloria bought it for me the year I turned 60, at a little pottery shop down in Oxford. It has a small chip on the handle, and the glaze has gone dull from years of washing. I do not use it anymore. I just keep it there. Some mornings I hold it a while before I make my coffee in a different cup. It still feels like her hands. I touched the rim of that mug with 2 fingers and walked out. The drive to Calvary Road, Missionary Baptist Church, takes 14 minutes in light traffic. At midnight in the rain, with the streets slick and nearly empty. I made it in 12. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in silence, watching the wipers push sheets of water off the windshield, watching the stoplights bleed across the wet asphalt. I turned onto Calvary Road. There were no fire trucks. There were no lights spinning against the low clouds. There was no orange glow pushing into the dark sky. No smoke drifting across the road. No smell of burning wood coming through my cracked window. I pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. Calvary Road. Missionary Baptist Church stood before me exactly as it had stood for 46 years. The old red brick walls were dark with rain but solid as ever. The white wooden steeple rose straight and clean against the night sky. The stained glass windows along the east wall, the ones Gloria had designed herself and paid for out of her own savings, caught the faint glow from the parking lot lamps and threw small broken colors into the wet air. Not one flame, not one wisp of smoke, not one crack in the glass. I sat in my car for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof. My son had called me in the middle of the night with a story about fire. He had described flames I could not see and damage that did not exist, and asked for money fast enough that I would not stop to question it. There was no fire burning in the east wing of that church, but my son had set a different kind of fire. I just did not know yet what it was meant to destroy. I drove home through streets that were empty and wet and quiet. When I got inside, I did not go to bed. I hung my raincoat on the hook by the door and walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table in the dark. I did not turn on the light. I just sat there with my hands flat on the tabletop, listening to the refrigerator hum and the rain work itself down to a drizzle outside the window. My phone stayed face down on the table in front of me the whole night. Terrence never called back. That silence told me more than any words could have. When a man has just witnessed his church burning, he calls back. He calls his father with updates, with grief, with relief when the flames are finally out. He does not call once, beg for money, and then go completely quiet. That kind of silence has weight. It settles into a room like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. By 5 a.m, the rain had stopped, and the sky outside my kitchen window had turned from black to a deep, bruised gray. I got up, made myself a cup of coffee, and drank it standing at the counter. Then I put on my coat and drove back to the church. The October morning was cold and sharp. Dead leaves from the oak trees along Calvary Road lay plastered flat against the wet sidewalk. The air smelled like wood smoke from somebody's fireplace somewhere nearby, and for just a second, before my mind caught up with my senses, my heart lurched. Then I turned into the parking lot and saw the church standing exactly where I had left it, solid and undamaged, and I breathed again. I unlocked the front door with my key and stepped inside. The church was dim and cold. No one had come in early to turn on the heat or open the blinds along the side walls. My footsteps echoed down the center aisle as I walked past the empty pews, past the wooden lectern where I had preached my last sermon 4 years ago, before I handed the pulpit over to Terrence. The stained glass along the east wall was dark without the sun behind it, but I could see the shapes Gloria had designed in the glass. A river bending through a stand of cottonwood trees, a single light burning above the water. I had watched her sketch those designs at the kitchen table over 3 winters. I walked through the sanctuary and down the hallway to the church office. The door was unlocked, which was not unusual, but when I stepped inside and reached for the filing cabinet along the far wall, my hand stopped before it touched the handle. There was a new padlock on the cabinet, not the old brass lock that had been there for 20 years. A new one, heavy and black, with a combination dial instead of a key slot. I stood looking at it for a long moment. I was the one who kept the master key to this office. I was the one who had managed the church records for 4 decades before Terrence took over. I had never in my life seen that cabinet with any lock but the original one. I touched the cold metal of the new lock with one finger and stepped back. I heard the front door of the church open down the hall. Terrence came into the office a few minutes later. He was wearing jeans and a fleece pullover, and he looked like a man who had not slept either, though his reasons were different from mine. When he saw me standing at the filing cabinet, something moved behind his eyes, quick as a bird crossing a window. "Dad," he said, "I did not expect you here this early." "I imagine you did not," I said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "About last night. The alarm company got it wrong. Faulty sensor in the east wing. Triggered the whole system for nothing. I am sorry I panicked and called you. There was never any fire." I looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He kept his eyes on the middle distance, somewhere past my left shoulder. "New lock on the cabinet," I said. "I have been meaning to upgrade the security around here. You know how it is." I nodded slowly. The way you nod when you are not agreeing with a person, but you need them to believe you are. We stood in the quiet of that office for a little while longer. Terrence with his hands in his pockets and his eyes still not quite meeting mine. And then he said he had some calls to make and excused himself down the hall. I went outside and sat on the front steps of the church. About 10 minutes later, Jimmy Holloway came walking up from the direction of the parking lot. Jimmy is 71 years old and a deacon here since before the building had central air. He walks with a slight lean from where a piece of shrapnel settled into his left hip somewhere outside of Da Nang in 1968. But he walks every morning regardless. Rain or cold or whatever the Lord sends down. He sat down on the step beside me without saying anything for a little while. "There were people here last night." "Walt," he said finally. "After midnight. 2 of them. A car I did not recognize parked around back, and 2 men went in through the side door. I watched from my car. They were inside for about 40 minutes. I looked out at Calvary Road. They needed me out of here," I said, more to myself than to Jimmy. "Looks that way," Jimmy said. "They had needed me gone." My son had built a fire out of words to push me out into the rain. And while I was driving 14 miles to stare at a church that was not burning, 2 strangers were inside doing something I was not meant to see. The question was not whether that was true. The question was why. Gloria kept keys to everything. That was simply her nature. In 41 years of marriage, I never once locked myself out of anything, because Gloria had thought ahead of me every single time. She had duplicates of the house key, the car key, the padlock on the garden shed. She kept them all on a flat ring in the kitchen drawer, labeled in her careful handwriting with small strips of masking tape. When she passed, I left that ring exactly where it was. I did not go back to the church that same day. I went home, ate something I could not taste, and sat with the television on and the sound turned down. I thought about what Jimmy had told me and what I had seen on that cabinet, and what Terrence had said with his eyes aimed carefully away from mine. I let it all settle the way you let creek water settle after you have stirred it up. By the time the sky outside had gone fully dark, I knew I was going back. I pulled the key ring out of the kitchen drawer just before 9 o'clock. There was a key on it I had not touched in years. A flat silver key with a strip of tape that read, "Church Office." Gloria had made a copy long before I retired, back when she used to come in on Saturday mornings to help count the weekly offering. She was more meticulous about the church finances than I ever was. I drove over with my flashlight and let myself in through the side entrance. The church at night is a different place than during the day. The same room that holds warmth and voices and the smell of candle wax on Sunday mornings becomes something older and quieter after dark. My flashlight swept across the empty pews and threw long shadows up the walls. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I did not want anyone driving past to see the church lit up and come to investigate. I walked down the hallway to the office and pushed the door open. The new padlock sat on the filing cabinet exactly where I had left it that morning. I stood in front of it and shone my flashlight across the combination dial. It was a simple 3-number lock, the kind found at any hardware store. The mounting bracket had been installed slightly crooked, one screw not fully seated. A man in a hurry does not think carefully about combinations. I thought about what Terrence knew by heart. He had grown up in this church. The number that lived deepest in his memory, attached to this place more than any other, was the year his father founded it. 1977. I turned the dial. 7 to the right, 7 to the left, 7 to the right again. The lock opened. I stood with it in my hand for a moment. Part of me had hoped it would not open. Part of me had wanted to be wrong. Several folders were missing from the cabinet. The original incorporation papers, the property deed records, the minutes from the last 5 years of board meetings. Taken. But they had not taken everything. In the back of the bottom drawer, behind a row of old financial ledgers, I found a manila folder I recognized. Gloria had maintained it as a secondary archive, a practice she called redundancy. She believed in keeping copies of the most important documents in a second location, in case the primary files were ever damaged or lost. She did this without making a fuss about it, the way she did most things. I set the folder on the desk and opened it under the flashlight beam. Inside were photocopies of old board resolutions, meeting agendas, financial summaries. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a document I did not recognize. It was a set of board meeting minutes, 3 pages long, dated the 14th of February of the previous year. I read through the first page slowly. The minutes recorded a special session of the church board, called to consider a proposal to enter into a strategic partnership with Living Word International Ministries. The board had voted unanimously in favor. All signatures were present, including mine at the bottom of the 3rd page. I stared at my name written in blue ink on that white paper, the 14th of February. I knew that date. I had spent that entire week at Methodist South Hospital with a pneumonia infection settled into my lower right lung. I had been on oxygen for 3 of those days. I had not left that building, had not signed a single piece of paper, had not attended any meeting of any kind. The signature was not mine. It was close. Whoever had done it had studied my handwriting with care. The letters had the right general shape, but I have always crossed the letter T in my name with a slight upward angle, a habit I carried from my 3rd grade teacher in Clarksdale. The signature on this page crossed it flat, straight across, no angle at all. Small thing. But I had been signing my name for 74 years. My son had forged my signature on the day I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting to breathe. While nurses checked my oxygen levels and doctors adjusted my medication, Terrence had been somewhere signing my name to a document that would begin dismantling everything I had spent my life building. I folded the document and put it in the inside pocket of my coat. I replaced the padlock, turned off the flashlight, and walked out through the side door into the cool night air. I stood beside the parking lot looking up at the steeple against the dark sky. 46 years. Every board meeting, every repair, every mortgage payment, every prayer over this ground. And it had taken one forged signature, written on a day when I was too sick to defend myself, to begin unraveling all of it. I slept for 4 hours, which was 3 more than I expected. When I woke, the October light was coming through the bedroom curtains at a low angle, the kind of light that arrives apologetically in the later part of the year, as if it knows it does not have long. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The folded document was on the nightstand where I had placed it the night before. It had not moved. Some part of me had half expected it to disappear by morning, the way bad dreams sometimes do. But it was still there, and everything I had read in the church office was still true. I got up, put on the coffee, and went to get the mail. The morning was cold and gray. A few dried leaves skittered across the porch boards when I opened the front door. The mailbox at the end of the walk held 3 envelopes. 2 were the usual kind, a utility bill and a circular from a grocery store. The third was a long white envelope with a blue return address printed in the upper left corner. Shelby County Assessor's Office. I took all 3 envelopes inside and set the first 2 on the kitchen counter without opening them. I sat down at the table with the third one. I drank a sip of coffee. I set the mug down. Then I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was a notice of property record update. Formal language. The kind that government offices use when they want to make something permanent sound routine. The gist of it was simple enough. The ownership record for the property at 1244 Calvary Road, Memphis, Tennessee, had been updated to reflect a change in title holder. The property, which had been held under the name Calvary Road Missionary Baptist Church, a non-profit religious corporation, was now recorded as belonging to Living Word International Holdings, LLC. The notice was dated 4 days ago. I read it twice, then set it flat on the table next to my coffee mug. Outside, a car went past on the street, somewhere down the block. A dog barked twice and went quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The world was carrying on exactly as it always did, indifferent to the fact that 46 years of work had just been reduced to a line in a county database. I thought about the men Jimmy had seen entering the church at 2 a.m. They had not come to steal anything in the ordinary sense. They had come to retrieve whatever original documents remained, the ones that, if examined too closely, might reveal the forged signatures and the altered records. They had been cleaning up after themselves. By the time those men drove away, the paper trail had been carefully managed, and 4 days later, the county had processed the ownership transfer as though it were the most ordinary transaction in the world. I picked up my phone and called Jimmy. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. Jimmy Holloway is not a man who lets a phone ring more than twice. He says it is a habit from his years in the service, when a delayed response could mean something went wrong. Old habits, he likes to say, are the only reliable kind. The church has been transferred, I told him. Officially, I just got the notice from the county. There was a pause. To who? Living Word International Holdings. That is the name on the paperwork. Another pause. Longer this time. I heard Jimmy set something down on a hard surface, the dull sound of a ceramic mug on a wooden table. "Walt," he said slowly. "Living Word International. That is Raymond Cross. You know that name. I know the buses. Big white buses with Living Word printed on the side in gold letters. They have been running through South Memphis for the better part of a year. I saw them parked outside Mount Zion over on Alston a few months back. And then the next thing I knew, Mount Zion was closed for renovations. It never reopened." He stopped. "It became a fitness center." I held the phone and looked at the county notice on my kitchen table. Raymond Cross. I did not know the man personally, but the name had weight to it in Memphis religious circles. He ran what people called a mega church out in Germantown, the kind of operation that looked more like a conference center than a house of worship. I had seen his face on billboards along the interstate, a broad smile, white teeth, the word vision printed in large letters beneath the image. I had never given him much thought. Men like that tended to stay in their own lane, and I had always stayed in mine. Until now, apparently, our lanes had merged. "I'm going to talk to Terrence," I said. "You want me to come with you?" "No," I said. "I need to do this one alone." I folded the county notice and put it in my coat pocket alongside the document I had taken from the church office the night before. Then I picked up my keys and walked to the car. The drive to Terrence's house takes about 20 minutes on a clear day. I did not hurry. I kept my hands easy on the wheel and let the traffic move at its own pace. I was not going over there to argue or to raise my voice. I was not going over there to make accusations I could not yet fully prove. I was going to look into my son's eyes and find out how much of the boy I raised was still in there. There was a new car in the driveway, a silver one, large and clean, with dealer plates still on it. I did not recognize the model, but I recognized what it meant. Terrence's salary as pastor of a community church, with a congregation of 200 and some members, did not accommodate new vehicles. I had seen his budget reports for years. I knew what the numbers looked like. I parked behind the silver car and walked up to the front door. Camille opened it before I could ring the bell. She was wearing a silk blouse and dark slacks, and her hair was done the way it was done when she was going somewhere important. Her expression, when she saw me standing on the porch, did not change. No surprise, no warmth, no ordinary shift in the face that people make when an unexpected visitor arrives. Just a careful stillness, the kind that comes from practice. "Walter," she said. "Camille, is Terrence home?" She held the door without fully opening it. "He is getting ready for a meeting. This will not take long," I said, and I stepped inside. It was not rudeness. It was simply the decision of a man who has run out of patience for being managed at the doorway of his own son's house. Camille stepped back, and I walked in. The living room had been redone since the last time I visited, which had been sometime in the spring. New furniture throughout. A deep sectional sofa in a gray fabric that still had the unworn look of something recently delivered. A large-screen television mounted on the wall above a cabinet I did not recognize. Fresh paint, a color close to cream, that made the room feel wider than it was. Everything was expensive and everything was new. Terrence came down the stairs tucking in a dress shirt. When he saw me, he stopped on the third step from the bottom. "Dad, I did not hear you come in." "Your wife let me," I said. I took the county notice from my coat pocket and held it out to him. He came the rest of the way down the stairs and took it. He read it slowly, or pretended to. His face did not show the surprise of a man reading something for the first time. "I can explain this," he said. "I would appreciate that very much," I said. He sat down on the edge of the new sofa. He did not invite me to sit, and I did not sit. I stood in the middle of the room with my hands in my coat pockets and waited. "The church has been struggling financially for a long time," he said. "You were not around to see it day to day, but the giving has been down for 3 years running. We were behind on the building insurance, behind on the maintenance fund. I had borrowed from the reserve account twice already just to cover utilities." He paused. "When Cross approached me about a strategic partnership, it felt like the only real option we had. He has resources we do not have, programs we cannot offer. I thought I was saving the church. Dad, I genuinely believed that. I listened to all of it. Then I reached into my other pocket and took out the folded copy of the board meeting minutes I had found the night before. I unfolded it and held it out to him. He looked at the paper without taking it from my hand. "That is not a real signature," I said. "The 14th of February. I was in Methodist South with pneumonia. I could not have signed anything that day. And you know it." Terrence looked at the document for a long moment. He did not say I was wrong. Where is my retirement account?" "Terrence," I asked. The room went very quiet. I took my phone from my pocket and opened the banking application. I had checked the balance that morning for the first time in several weeks. I was not a man who monitored numbers compulsively. I trusted that what I had put away over the years would be there when I needed it. I had trusted that. I turned the phone screen toward him. The account showed a balance of $412. $50,000 had been withdrawn in 2 transfers. The first 8 months ago, the second 3 months ago. The authorization on each transfer carried a digital signature I had never made. Terrence looked at the screen. He looked at his hands. He did not say anything at all. "Terrence." It was Camille's voice, from somewhere behind me. I turned. She was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. One shoulder leaned against the frame, her arms folded across her chest. Her voice was even and entirely without apology. It was a necessary investment. "Walter, the partnership required capital from both sides. The church needed to demonstrate its commitment." I looked at her for a moment. In all the years I had known Camille Fontaine, I had never once heard her call anything by its true name. She arranged words the way a person arranges furniture, to present a room in its best light, to guide the eye away from what was damaged or missing. $50,000 that my wife and I had saved across 30 years of modest living was not a necessary investment. It was not a demonstration of commitment. It was my retirement fund, set aside for the years when my body would no longer do what I asked of it. I put my phone back in my pocket. I picked up the county notice from where Terrence had set it on the cushion beside him. I folded it neatly and put it back in my coat. Then I walked to the front door, opened it, and closed it behind me. Not hard, not with any drama. I closed it the way you close a casket, gently, and with a terrible kind of finality. I did not go home after I left Terrence's house. I drove to the church instead. I do not know exactly why. Some pull that I could not have explained in words brought me there. The way a man in trouble sometimes ends up at the place that has always meant the most to him before he can think clearly about where he is going. I let myself in through the front and sat down in the third pew from the back, on the left side, which is where I always sat before I became the pastor, when I was still just a young man in his late 20s who had recently moved to Memphis and found his way to this building one Sunday morning, because he could hear the singing from the street. The church was empty and still. The morning light had shifted, and the sun was coming through Gloria's stained glass at a low angle, throwing a pale blue cast across the floor and the first few rows of pews. The river she had put in the glass glowed the color of shallow water over pale stone. I sat and looked at it for a while. There are questions a man can ask himself in a quiet place that he cannot ask anywhere else. Sitting there, I asked myself what I had and what I needed, and who in this world I could trust with both. The first two I could answer clearly enough. What I had was a forged document, a county transfer notice, an empty retirement account, and the certain knowledge that my son had helped a stranger take away the work of my life. What I needed was someone with the skills to do something about it, before what had already been done became impossible to undo. The third question was the important one. I thought about Gloria. Specifically, I thought about a woman she had brought home for dinner one evening about 20 years ago. Her name was Rose Parker, and she was 32 years old, and she had been staying at a women's shelter off Lamar Avenue for 6 weeks after leaving a marriage that had cost her 2 years and a broken collarbone. Gloria had met her there, every third Saturday for years. Gloria had volunteered at that shelter, running what she called a basics class, teaching reading and writing and simple arithmetic to women who had come through situations that had not left them much room for anything else. Rose. Gloria told me that first evening was different from most. She was sharp and curious, and she had a way of asking questions that cut straight to what mattered. She just needed someone to believe that about her out loud. Gloria was good at that, believing in people out loud. Over the next several years, Gloria helped Rose get her GED, then encouraged her to apply to community college, then to the journalism program at the University of Memphis. Rose worked nights at a grocery store and went to school during the day and graduated in 3.5 years. She was hired by the Memphis Commercial Appeal as a staff reporter and spent the next decade working her way up to senior investigative correspondent. She had broken 3 major stories in the last 5 years alone, including one about a housing developer who had been bribing city inspectors for nearly a decade. She and Gloria had stayed close until the end. Gloria had been to every one of Rose's award ceremonies. Rose had been at Gloria's bedside in the last week. I took my phone out of my pocket and called her. Rose answered after 2 rings. Her voice was awake and direct, the way it always was, as though she kept herself ready at any hour for a conversation that required full attention. "Walt," she said, "I was wondering when you would call." "You heard something?" "I hear things," she said simply. "Tell me what you know." I told her everything. I took my time and left nothing out. I described the midnight call and the drive to the church and what I had found in the filing cabinet and the county notice and the conversation with Terrence and Camille and the retirement account that now held $400 where $50,000 had been. Rose did not interrupt. She listened the way a good reporter listens, taking it all in without reacting, letting the complete picture form before she began to sort through it. I need an hour," she said when I finished. "I will come to you." She arrived at the church in 55 minutes. She came through the front door carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a canvas tote that clinked when she set it on the pew beside me. 2 thermoses of coffee. She looked at the stained glass for a moment before she sat down. "I used to come and sit in here sometimes after Gloria passed," she said quietly. "I did not tell anyone. I just needed to be somewhere she had been." We sat together in the quiet for a minute. Then she opened the laptop bag, and as she was lifting the computer out, her hand touched something at the bottom of the bag and she paused. "No, there is something I need to tell you." she said. Gloria gave me an envelope about a month before she died. Sealed. She asked me to keep it safe and told me not to open it unless Calvary Road was ever in serious danger. She looked at me directly. I think that time has come, Walt. But I want to do some investigating first. I want to understand what we are dealing with before we open it. Whatever she put in that envelope, she put it there for a reason, and I want to make sure we use it at the right moment. I nodded. Rose had always understood timing. She set the envelope, thin and cream-colored with Gloria's handwriting on the front, on the pew between us. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up Living Word International Holdings. What she found in the first 30 minutes made both of us go completely silent. She had found a pattern. Rose turned the laptop screen toward me and walked me through it the way she had learned to present a story, starting with the facts and working outward toward what the facts meant. Living Word International Holdings was registered as a nonprofit religious corporation in the state of Tennessee. Raymond Cross had founded it 11 years ago with a single mega-church campus in Germantown. By the time Rose started pulling records that morning, Living Word operated 8 campuses across 4 states and controlled real estate holdings worth, by conservative estimate, somewhere north of $40 million. That part is not unusual, Rose said. There are large church networks all over the South. What is unusual is this. She pulled up a spreadsheet she had assembled from public records, news archives, and county property databases across 3 states. Down the left side was a list of churches, 12 of them. Down the right side were dates and outcomes. I read through the list slowly. Mount Zion Missionary Baptist, Memphis, Tennessee. Partnership with Living Word announced 18 months ago. Congregation dispersed. Building demolished 7 months later. Property currently operating as a fitness center franchise. Bethel AME Church. Jackson, Mississippi. Partnership announced 2 years ago. Building demolished 14 months later. Property currently a parking structure serving a downtown hotel. Greater First Baptist, Birmingham, Alabama. 104 years old. Founded in 1920 by a congregation that had been meeting in a barn since before the First World War. Partnership announced 3 years ago. Building demolished 16 months later. Property currently a strip mall anchored by a payday loan office and a cell phone retailer. Calvary Hill Community Church. Selma, Alabama. I stopped when I reached that one. Selma. There are places in this country whose names carry everything a certain generation of Americans has left inside them. I was 22 years old when the photographs from the Edmund Pettus Bridge came through on the television news. I had watched men and women I did not know absorb violence in the name of something larger than themselves. And I had made a decision that Sunday about what I wanted my life to be for. Calvary Hill had been one of the organizing churches during that period. It had hosted mass meetings. It had sheltered people who came from across the country to march. Living Word Partnership announced 4 years ago. Building demolished 22 months later. Property currently a drive-through fast food franchise. I looked away from the screen for a moment. All 12, I said. All 12, Rose said. Same structure every time. Cross approaches a church that is struggling, usually one with an aging congregation and some financial difficulty. He offers a partnership, frames it as an expansion of ministry, talks about resources and programs and reaching new generations. The pastor signs on. Sometimes the congregation votes. Sometimes they do not. The paperwork goes through the county. And then, within 18 months, every single time, the building comes down, and the congregation's told they will be absorbed into the nearest Living Word campus. Some of them make the transition. Most do not. People who have worshipped in the same building for 40 years do not generally find their way into a megachurch in the suburbs. She paused. They just stop going. Or they find something smaller somewhere else, if they can. I thought about the families at Calvary Road, the Hendersons, who had occupied the fourth pew on the right side for 3 generations. Old Brother Timmons, who had been playing the piano at Sunday services since before I arrived, and whose hands had gone stiff with arthritis, but who still came and played every week without complaint. The women from the Thursday morning prayer group, who had been meeting in the fellowship hall for 22 years, and who had been through births and deaths and divorces and illnesses together in that room. Where would they go? He targeted Black community churches specifically, I said. Every single one on this list is a historically Black congregation, Rose said. Every one of them is in a neighborhood that has been experiencing some form of commercial development pressure in the last decade. Every one of them sat on land that was worth more to a developer than the property was generating as a church. She closed the spreadsheet and looked at me. Raymond Cross is not in the religion business. Walt, he is in the land acquisition business. The cross on his building is a marketing tool. I sat with that for a moment. There is a particular kind of anger that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with heat or noise. It settles in slowly. The way cold air settles into a room after a window has been left open for hours, and by the time you notice it, it has reached into every corner. He approached Terence, I said. He knew exactly what he was looking at when he saw this church. The location, the age of the congregation, the financial situation. Shocked, and he knew how to get to the pastor, Rose said. He always finds the weak point. In Selma, it was a deferred roof repair that was going to cost more than the building fund had. In Birmingham, it was a dispute between 2 board members that had fractured the congregation. Here it was. She stopped, choosing the word carefully. Ambition. She was right. She was not saying it cruelly. She was saying it the way a doctor names a diagnosis, without comfort but without malice either. Terence had been ambitious for as long as I could remember. It was not a fault in itself. Ambition directed well is just another word for calling. But ambition without ballast, without the weight of something larger than yourself holding it in place, can carry a man somewhere he never intended to go. There is one more thing, Rose said. She pulled up a second set of documents. The money. She spread 4 financial summary pages across the screen. But the money trail, she said, is the part that made my blood run cold. Rose had 4 documents open on the screen, and she moved between them the way a surgeon moves between instruments. Living Word International files as a religious nonprofit, she said. That means their financial records are partially public. Not everything, but enough. I pulled their last 3 years of IRS filings. She pointed to the first document. Look at the income column. I looked. The numbers were large, even for a multi-campus operation. But what Rose was pointing to was not the total income. She was pointing to a specific line item that appeared each year under the category of international missionary support donations. In the last 3 years, Rose said, Living Word received $11.4 million in international missionary donations. That is money coming from overseas accounts, listed as charitable support for their global outreach ministry. Is that unusual? For a church their size, yes. Their domestic giving is about $2 million a year, That is roughly what you would expect for 8 campuses with their reported membership, but 11 million from international donors. She shook her head. I pulled the records for 5 comparable megachurch networks across the South. Their international donations average around 3% of total income. Living Words are 61%. She paused to let that land. Nobody's overseas mission work generates 61% of their total budget. That money is not coming from overseas Christians moved by the Holy Spirit. It is coming from business entities using a church's tax exemption to move money through the American banking system. I looked at the numbers for a long moment. They are washing the money through the church, I said. That is my assessment. Rose said, the church is the machine. The property acquisitions are the justification. You absorb a congregation. You record the partnership fee as a capital contribution on your books. You use the combined assets to claim the real estate transaction was a legitimate non-profit expansion. The auditors see a growing religious organization acquiring community properties. They do not see a laundering operation dressed in a choir robe. She moved to the second document. Now, the partnership fees. She pulled up a summary table. Every church on that list paid Living Word a partnership capital contribution before the transfer was finalized. The amounts varied, smaller congregations, smaller fees. The average was around $65,000. I already knew where this was going, but I let her finish. Calvary Road's fee was set at $75,000. Rose said, she looked at me directly. Terrence paid the first installment 8 months ago, $50,000. My retirement account, the money Gloria and I had saved across 30 years of modest living, pulling a little aside every month, never touching it. Building something that was supposed to carry me through the years when I could no longer work. Transferred in 2 withdrawals, quietly, into a Living Word partnership account, as a down payment on the theft of a church that did not belong to Terrence to give away. The remaining balance, I said. $25,000, Rose said. I sat back against the pew, the midnight call. My son's voice cracking with manufactured panic. The story about the church burning and the contractor and the money that had to be wired immediately. Right now, before I had time to ask the questions I would have asked in daylight. That phone call had not been about a fire. It had been a collection call. Terrence had owed Cross $25,000 to complete the transaction. And he had tried to get it from me the only way he knew how, which was to frighten me badly enough that I would not stop to think. When I refused, the county transfer had gone through anyway. Cross had accepted partial payment and filed the paperwork. Perhaps he had decided the remaining balance could be settled later. Or perhaps he had never cared much about the money itself. Perhaps $25,000 was simply not a significant number to a man moving $11 million a year through a set of offshore accounts. Where is the overseas money coming from? I asked. That is harder to trace, Rose said. The donor names on the filings are holding company names registered in Belize and the Cayman Islands. I have calls in to 2 sources I trust. But what I can tell you is that the pattern matches what I have seen before when I covered the housing developer story 2 years ago. You build enough layers between the source and the destination, and it looks like clean money by the time it hits American soil. She closed the second document and looked at me. Well, whoever is funding Cross from overseas, they are getting something in return, whether it is the land itself, or a cut of the development proceeds, or simply a clean place to park dirty money. I do not know yet. But this is not a church operation with a side interest in real estate. This is a financial operation using the legal protections of a church to move money that cannot go through normal channels. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. I looked out at the empty pews. The afternoon light had moved, and Gloria's stained glass was darker now, the colors muted. The river in the glass looked less like water and more like stone. 46 years ago, I had stood at the front of this room and preached my first sermon from a handwritten outline on a single sheet of paper. I had talked about foundation, about what a life built on solid ground looked like, and what happened when the ground gave way. I had been 29 years old, and I had not known nearly as much as I thought I did. I knew something now. The man who called himself a shepherd of God was running the largest financial slaughterhouse I had ever seen, and my son had opened the gate. The phone rang at 5:14 in the morning. I had been awake since 4, lying in the dark the way I had been doing most nights that week, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around me. When I saw Rose's name on the screen, I answered before the second ring had finished. "I found it," she said. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she had been working through the night. Flat and focused, stripped of everything that was not essential. "You need to come to the church. Bring coffee if you have it made." I had it made. I had been making coffee at 4 in the morning for 40 years. Rose was already set up in the front pew when I arrived. Her laptop open and 3 pages of handwritten notes spread across the seat beside her. The church was cold. Neither of us had thought to turn on the heat. She wrapped her hands around the thermos I handed her and got straight to the point. "The overseas money," she said. I traced it. She had spent the night following the shell company chains she had identified the day before. The holding companies in Belize and the Cayman Islands turned out to be registered subsidiaries of a parent entity incorporated in Delaware, which in turn was controlled by a limited liability company called Magnolia Crown Entertainment Group. Shakti. They are a casino and hotel development company based in Nashville, Rose said. They have built 4 properties in the last 8 years, all in mid-sized southern cities. They specialize in what they call urban entertainment districts, mixed-use developments, casino floor, hotel, restaurants, concert venue. She pulled up a photograph on the laptop screen. It showed a large architectural rendering, glass and steel and artificial lighting, the kind of building that looked like it had been designed to be visible from the interstate. This is their current project. They are calling it Magnolia Crown Memphis. I looked at the rendering for a moment. Then I looked at Rose. "Where is it supposed to be built?" I asked. "South Memphis, anchored by a 4-block footprint between Lamar and Bellevue." She pointed to a smaller image in the corner of the screen, a site map with property lines and street grids. She tapped one parcel near the center. "This one, 1244 Calvary Road." I set my coffee down on the armrest of the pew. The development permit application was filed with the city planning office 6 months ago. Rose said. 6 months ago? Walt? Terrence signed the first partnership documents 8 months ago. The land was already spoken for before the ink was dry. Magnolia Crown did not acquire Calvary Road. They paid Cross to acquire it for them, using the missionary donation structure to move the money without leaving a direct connection between a casino developer and a church transfer. I said nothing. I was working through the arithmetic of it. 8 months ago, Terrence had agreed to help dismantle this church. 6 months ago, the land had already been sold to a casino company. The church had never been part of any real partnership with anyone. It had simply been a piece of land that someone wanted, occupied by people who were in the way. There is one more thing, Rose said. She opened a document that looked different from the others. The formatting was internal, the kind of thing that was never meant to leave the organization that produced it. I have a source, she said simply. Someone who worked inside Living Word's administrative office for 3 years and left last spring. She kept copies of things she thought might matter someday. She was right. She turned the laptop screen toward me. This is an internal communication between Cross and his senior legal counsel, dated 4 months ago. I read it. The email was direct in the way that people are direct when they believe they are in a private conversation. Cross was discussing contingency planning for the Calvary Road acquisition. His concern was that the Memphis transaction had more exposure than their previous deals because the founding pastor was still living and still connected to the congregation. If the transaction drew scrutiny, the pastor who had signed the transfer documents would be the face of the deal. The attorney's response, quoted in the thread, recommended ensuring that all contractual documentation pointed to the local pastor as the independent decision-maker, acting without direction from Living Word. At the bottom of the thread, Cross had replied with 4 sentences. I read them twice. He wrote that the pastor's son had signed everything under his own name and authority. He wrote that if investigators came asking, the story was simple. A local pastor had made a series of bad financial decisions, misappropriated funds from his congregation, and reached out to Living Word for help covering his debts. He wrote that Living Word had acted in good faith throughout. He wrote that the pastor's son would take the fall, and that was as it should be. I set the laptop carefully on the pew beside me. I thought about Terrence as a boy, 6 years old, sitting in the front row every Sunday morning with his legs dangling because he was still too short for his feet to reach the floor. I thought about the morning he told me he felt called to preach, how his voice had shaken with the weight of saying it out loud. I thought about all the wrong turns he had taken getting from that boy to the man who had signed his name to documents in a lawyer's office somewhere and believed he was buying himself a future. He had not been buying anything. He had been signing his own confession. My son thought he was climbing a golden ladder into a life he had always wanted. He did not know that the man holding the ladder had already decided he was more useful at the bottom of a criminal indictment than at the top of any organization. He did not know that the ladder was about to be pulled out from under his feet. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror the next morning and practiced looking defeated. It took me a while to get it right. 74 years of pastoral work trains you toward a different set of expressions: patience, steadiness, the particular calm a congregation needs to see from the front of the room when things are difficult. Grief and sorrow, yes. But the specific look of a man who has run out of fight, who has set down everything he was carrying and cannot pick it back up. That required some deliberate effort. I let my shoulders go forward. I softened the line of my jaw. I took the focus out of my eyes in the way that happens when a person stops looking at what is in front of them and starts looking at something unreachable, something far away and lost. I held the expression for a count of 10. Then I straightened up and got dressed. Rose was building the legal case carefully and systematically, the way she built every case. But we did not yet have the one piece she had said was the difference between probable cause and conviction. We needed Raymond Cross to say out loud, on record, what he had done. A man who knows he is being watched does not say those things. A man who believes he has already won sometimes cannot stop himself. I needed Cross to believe he had already won. Rose arrived at the house at 9. She came in through the back door with her laptop bag and a folder of printed pages, the quiet efficiency of someone who had slept 4 hours and was not going to mention it. Jimmy was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a bag of biscuits from the place on Elvis Presley Boulevard, being present without being intrusive. That was Jimmy's way. He had been doing it for 40 years. I laid out the plan for both of them. Jimmy set down his biscuit and looked at me. "Walt, you want to walk into that man's church and shake his hand. I want him to believe I am shaking his hand because I have no other options," I said. "And you think he will not see through it? Raymond Cross has been doing this for 11 years, I said. He has sat across from a lot of tired old men and watched them give up things they had spent their whole lives building. That experience has made him very confident in his ability to read a room, and that confidence is exactly the weakness we are going to use." Jimmy considered this. He picked up his biscuit again. "All right," he said. Rose explained the recording device she would use, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, with a range sufficient for any normal conversation in an enclosed room. She needed me to wear a button-down with a chest pocket. She needed me not to touch the pocket once it was set. While she talked, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard. The oak tree back there had been old when we moved in. Gloria had planted a rose bed along the fence beneath it the summer we celebrated our 20th anniversary. The roses were bare stubs now in October, waiting for spring, the way they waited every year. I thought of something Gloria had said about 8 months before she passed. We had been sitting in the living room in the evening, not talking about anything in particular. She had looked at me and said, almost absently, as if completing a thought she had been working on alone for some time, "Walter, don't you worry about this house of God. I already took care of it. I had taken it as comfort." The kind of thing a person of deep faith says when making peace with what they cannot control. I had held her hand and not asked what she meant, because I thought I understood. Standing at the kitchen window now, I let the memory sit. Something in it had begun to feel different to me. Less like comfort and more like instruction. I did not know yet what she had meant, but I filed it carefully in the back of my mind, the way you file a piece of a sermon that has not found its place yet. "Walt," Rose said from the table. "Ready?" I turned from the window and sat down. Rose handed me a dark blue button-down shirt from a paper bag. She had thought of everything, the way Gloria always had. I picked up my phone and dialed Terrence. He answered on the third ring, cautious and uncertain, the way he had been answering all week. "Dad," he said. "I have been doing a lot of thinking," I said. I kept my voice low and slow, with a heaviness in it that was not entirely manufactured. "Maybe you were right. Maybe I have been holding on too hard to something that needs to move forward. I am an old man. Terrence. I am tired." The silence on the other end lasted about 3 seconds. "Dad," he said, and the relief in his voice was plain. The release of a man who has been bracing for something and suddenly feels the tension leave his shoulders. "I think that is the right decision. I really do. I would like to meet Pastor Cross first," I said. "Before anything is finalized, just to sit down with the man face to face, as a courtesy." "Of course," Terrence said. "I will arrange it. I will call you tomorrow." We said goodbye. I set the phone on the table. My son believed every word of it, because he wanted to believe it. He needed it to be true. That is the particular weakness of a guilty conscience. It is always looking for permission to rest. Terrence called the next morning with the address and the time. I drove out to Germantown on a gray Thursday afternoon. The neighborhood sits about 20 miles east of South Memphis, And the transition between the two is the kind you notice without being told what it means. The streets get wider, the trees get bigger. The houses set themselves back from the road behind long lawns and privacy hedges, and the spaces between things expand in a way that has always felt less like comfort to me, and more like deliberate distance. The Living Word International Campus occupied what had once been a large shopping center. The parking lot alone was larger than the entire block where Calvary Road sat. The original retail structures had been demolished and replaced with a complex of interconnected buildings in a contemporary style. All glass and pale stone and landscaped walkways connecting the various facilities. There was a welcome center with sliding glass doors and a waterfall feature in the lobby visible from the parking lot. There were signboards listing the week's programs, the way a hotel lists its amenities. I parked my car between a late-model SUV and a pickup truck with a Living Word sticker on the rear window and sat for a moment. The church I had built had a wooden front door that stuck in the summer humidity and required a firm push to open. It had a fellowship hall with folding tables and metal chairs that scraped against the linoleum floor. It had a ceiling that had needed replastering twice since I founded it, and a furnace that gave trouble every February without fail. I put on my expression and went inside. A young woman at the Welcome Center directed me down a carpeted corridor lined with framed photographs of Cross at various events, ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, what appeared to be a meeting with a state senator. A man in a fitted blazer met me halfway down the hall, introduced himself as Cross's executive assistant, and led me to a suite of offices at the far end of the building. Raymond Cross was standing when I was shown in, which was a calculation. A man who stands to receive a visitor controls whether that visitor sits. He was taller than I had expected from the billboards, broad through the shoulders, well-dressed in the way of men who spend money on clothing without appearing to. He extended his hand before I had fully crossed the threshold, a move designed to put the handshake on his terms, on his ground, in the center of his space. I took his hand and let mine go limp, slightly damp. I let my eyes be tired. "Reverend Jenkins," he said, "it is an honor. Please sit down." The office had a sitting area near the window, 2 chairs and a low table. He gestured toward one and took the other, settling into it with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own surroundings. Through the window behind him, I could see a landscaped courtyard with a stone path and a small grove of crepe myrtles in late-season color. "I want you to know," he said, "how much I respect what you built over these 46 years. A community church that size, that history, that is not a small thing. That is a life's work." "It is," I said. I kept my voice soft and my eyes slightly unfocused. "That is why this has been difficult." He nodded with the practiced empathy of someone who had sat in this chair many times. "Change is always difficult, especially for men of our generation, who built things with their hands and their faith and their own sweat. But growth requires transition. That is as true in the church as it is anywhere." "The stained glass windows," I said. "My wife designed them. Would it be possible to preserve them in whatever the new space becomes?" He held my gaze for a moment. And in that moment, I saw something beneath the practiced empathy. A faint flicker of calculation. The same look a man makes when he is deciding how honest to be. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "We are going to be doing a full redevelopment of that site. The structure itself is not suited for what we have in mind, and frankly, our development partners have their own requirements for the footprint." He spread his hands in a gesture of regret that had no regret in it. "Everything comes down. A new facility goes up. That is the nature of urban renewal." "Development partners," I said, in the tone of a man hearing unfamiliar terminology. The Magnolia people, he said, with the ease of someone who sees no reason to be careful. They are handling the commercial side of things. It frees us to focus on the ministry aspect. He smiled. It is actually a very elegant arrangement. I nodded slowly, the way a confused old man nods when he is trying to follow something beyond him. Of course, I said. I understand. Your congregation will find a home, he said, shifting his tone to something warmer. The nearest Living Word campus is 12 minutes from Calvary Road. Excellent programs, excellent facilities. Your people will be well cared for. He went on for a while longer. I listened. I asked a few more soft questions, the kind a tired man asks when he has already accepted what he is being told and only wants the details. Cross answered them easily, with the confidence of a man who believed the conversation was already over. When we stood to leave, he extended his hand again. I took it. This time I held it with my full grip. I am 74 years old, and I spent 35 of those years carrying a mailbag through the streets of Memphis in every kind of weather. My hands are not what they once were, but they still know how to hold something firmly. I looked Raymond Cross in the eye and shook his hand. I made sure my grip was the grip of a man who had already won, Rose called at 9 that evening. I got it, she said. Every word. You need to hear this. She had not gone home after dropping me at my car. She had followed Cross's vehicle from the Living Word campus to a restaurant in East Memphis, a steakhouse with private dining rooms that catered to the kind of business conversation people do not want overheard. She had arrived 10 minutes after Cross and had been seated, by arrangement with a contact who worked in the reservations office, at a table separated from his by a single partition wall. I drove to her apartment and she played me the recording. The audio was clean. Rose had used a device with a directional microphone, and the ambient noise of the restaurant, the low hum of conversation, and the movement of staff sat beneath the voices the way a river sits beneath the sound of people talking on a bridge. Cross was there with one other voice, a man Rose had identified as a senior executive from Magnolia Crown's Regional Development Office. They had been talking for some time before the recording began to capture the relevant material. I sat at Rose's kitchen table and listened. Cross spoke with the ease of a man entirely at home in private rooms. There was no performance in his voice the way there had been in his office that afternoon. In his office, he had been presenting himself. Here he was simply being himself, which turned out to be a considerable distance from the presentation. He talked about the Memphis project with the business-like satisfaction of someone reviewing a completed transaction. The Calvary Road site was secured. The county transfer was on record. Demolition permitting was moving through the city office on schedule. The Magnolia Crown groundbreaking was tentatively set for early spring. These old Negro congregations, I heard him say, in a tone so casual it was almost bored. They don't know what their land is worth. Never did. You go in there with the right language, the right promises about ministry and legacy and carrying on the mission, and they hand you the keys every single time. I sat very still. The Magnolia Crown man said something about timeline. Cross responded that the Memphis pastor had been particularly easy because he was ambitious and unhappy, a combination Cross described as almost professionally useful. He said Terrence had done everything asked of him without requiring much beyond the promise of a position and a salary figure that would have seemed extraordinary to someone who had grown up in a South Memphis parsonage. Then the Magnolia Crown man asked about exposure. Cross's answer was measured and practiced, the kind of answer a man gives when he has thought through a contingency many times. The pastor signed everything, he said. The partnership agreement, the transfer documents, the capital contribution authorization, all under his own name, all with his own pen. If anyone comes looking at this transaction, the story writes itself. Local pastor with financial troubles and personal ambitions makes a series of decisions that disadvantage his congregation. Living Word acted as a good faith acquirer. We have documentation for everything. A pause. He takes the fall. That is what he is there for. The recording ran for another 11 minutes after that. Cross and the Magnolia Crown man discussed financing terms, a disputed easement on an adjacent property, a restaurant recommendation. The conversation ended with the sound of chairs moving and brief pleasantries. Rose stopped the playback. We sat in her kitchen for a moment without speaking. Through the window above her sink, I could see the lights of the city spread out to the west, orange and white against the low October sky. It is strong, Rose said finally. The contempt is clear. The intent is explicit. A federal prosecutor would find a great deal to work with in 11 minutes of audio. She picked up her coffee mug and held it in both hands. But Cross will have defense attorneys who have handled cases like this before. They will argue the recording was obtained improperly. They will argue the language is ambiguous. That fall guy is colloquial rather than conspiratorial. They will build doubt, because building doubt is what they are paid to do. What do we need? I asked. Documentary evidence that Cross knew the property he was acquiring was legally protected before he filed the transfer. She said, something that proves he understood he was not acquiring a simple church congregation, but rather attempting to circumvent a legal instrument. If we can show he knew and proceeded anyway, we move from financial fraud into federal obstruction territory. That is much harder to defend against. I nodded slowly. I thought about Gloria's voice in the living room 8 months before she died. The way she had said it without preamble, without context, as if she were confirming something she had already decided. Walter, don't you worry about this house of God. I already took care of it. I had spent 46 years learning that Gloria Jenkins was not a woman who said things she did not mean. She was not given to empty reassurance. When she told you something was handled, it was handled. When she told you not to worry about something, she had given it sufficient thought that worry was genuinely unnecessary. She had seen something coming. She had prepared for it. And she had left the preparation with Rose. The envelope, I said. Rose looked at me. It is time to open the envelope. We had the recording. We had the paper trail. We had the evidence of what Cross had done and what he intended to do to my son in the process. We had a weapon. But what I needed now was not a weapon. What I needed was a shield. The kind of legal protection that would make Calvary Road untouchable regardless of what any defense attorney argued in any courtroom. I believed Gloria had left exactly that in Rose's keeping. I just had not known it until now. Rose brought the envelope the following morning. She set it on the kitchen table between us without ceremony. The way she set down everything that mattered. It was cream-colored and had gone slightly yellow at the edges with time. The flap was sealed with a dark red wax seal pressed with the image of a small cross, a detail I recognized immediately. Gloria had owned the seal for years. She had used it for documents she considered final. On the front, in Gloria's handwriting, were 4 words, for Walt, when needed. I looked at it for a long moment. Rose said nothing. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the furnace running in the basement, a sound I had been meaning to attend to. I picked up the envelope and broke the seal. Inside were 3 items. The first was a single page on formal letterhead from the Tennessee State Historic Preservation Office, dated approximately 4.5 years ago. It was a certificate of enrollment confirming that Calvary Road Missionary Baptist Church, located at 1244 Calvary Road, Memphis, Tennessee, had been officially entered into the National Register of Historic Places. The registration cited the church's founding role in the community during the Civil Rights era, its 46 years of continuous service to the South Memphis neighborhood, and its architectural significance as an example of mid-century African-American religious construction. The second item was a legal document, 11 pages, prepared by a law firm whose letterhead I did not recognize. It was the instrument establishing the Calvary Road Community Heritage Trust, an irrevocable charitable trust under federal law, with the church property transferred into the trust as its primary asset. The beneficiaries of the trust were listed as the congregation and the broader community it served. The trustee was listed as Walter James Jenkins. The document was signed and notarized, with a filing date that preceded Gloria's death by approximately 5 months. I read both documents carefully. Then I set them on the table and picked up the third item. It was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten, in the particular handwriting I had spent 41 years learning to read. Gloria wrote in a hand that leaned slightly to the right, with letters that were small and even, each one given the same careful attention. She had told me once that her 3rd-grade teacher had made her practice penmanship every day for a full year, and the habit had never left her. I read it slowly. She had written that she first noticed the changes in the neighborhood about 5 years before she died. Men with clipboards and measuring equipment walking the sidewalks. A letter from a real estate investment group offering to buy the church property at a figure that was, she wrote, large enough to be serious and structured in a way that suggested someone had studied the zoning maps. She had done some research of her own, asking questions of people she trusted in the city planning office, and had learned that the South Memphis corridor where the church sat was under active consideration for commercial rezoning. She had not told me about any of this. She wrote, because she knew me well enough to know how I would respond. I would have organized the congregation. I would have written letters and attended city council meetings and made it a matter of public principle. And I would have lost. Because the people with money and access to zoning boards were not going to be moved by the principles of a retired mail carrier and his congregation, no matter how righteous those principles were. So she had done it differently. She had found a law firm that specialized in historic preservation and community land trusts. She had paid for the initial consultation out of money she had set aside from her own small savings over several years without mentioning it to me. She had gathered the historical documentation for the National Register application herself, working with the church's own archives and reaching out to longtime members who remembered the early years. The registration had taken 14 months to complete. The trust had taken another 8. By the time she was done, the church and the land it sat on were legally insulated in a way that no private sale, no county transfer, no partnership agreement signed by anyone, including me, could disturb. The irrevocable nature of the trust meant that the property could not be transferred out of community ownership without a legal proceeding involving both federal and state oversight. The National Register designation meant that any attempt to demolish the structure would require federal environmental review. Any contract signed by Terrence transferring ownership to Living Word International was, as a matter of law, void. He had not owned the property to transfer. I set the letter down when I had finished reading it. I put both hands flat on the table and looked at the window above the sink. Outside, the October morning was still and pale. Rose did not say anything. She understood when silence was the right response. After a while, I picked the letter back up and read the final paragraph again. Gloria had written that she knew she might not be there to see how things unfolded. She wrote that she had done what she could do with what she had, and that she trusted the rest to me and to the people who would gather in that building long after both of us were gone. She wrote that she loved me and loved the church, and was not afraid of what was coming because she believed the foundation was solid. She ended with 6 words. Keep preaching. Walter, I am listening. I sat in my kitchen and let the tears come. They were not the helpless tears of a man who has lost something. They were something that felt more like gratitude, more like grief, more like love than any single word I could find. Gloria Jenkins had been gone for 4 years, and she was still fighting for us. She had laid the groundwork for this day before she ever left. Now it was my turn to finish what she had started. I called Terrence that afternoon. I would like to hold one last service, I told him. A farewell, before the transition is finalized. I want to say goodbye to the congregation properly. Preach one more time from my own pulpit. I let a tremble come into my voice. It would mean a great deal to me, son. He agreed without hesitation, and I heard the relief in his voice like water finding level. He said he would make sure Cross was there, and the legal team, and that everything would be ready for the formal signing afterward. I thanked him and said I would see him Sunday. That night I went to the bedroom closet and took out the garment bag from the back. Inside was the suit I had worn to Gloria's funeral. Dark charcoal, nearly black, with a fine weave that held its shape across the years. I had not worn it since that day. Some part of me had treated it as belonging to grief alone, a garment reserved for the worst occasions. I hung it on the back of the door and looked at it for a while. Then I thought about what Gloria had written. Keep preaching. Walter. I took the suit down and pressed it. Sunday came in under a bright, cold sky. The October light was the particular kind that Memphis gets in the last weeks of autumn. Clean and low, and somehow both cheerful and melancholy at once. I dressed carefully. White shirt, dark tie, the charcoal suit. I shined my shoes in slow circles with a soft cloth until I could see the light reflected in the leather. Before leaving, I touched the rim of Gloria's coffee mug. I arrived an hour before the service. Jimmy was already there. He had unlocked the building, turned on the heat, and set the candles at the altar. He was wearing his good suit and nodded once when I came through the door. We did not need words. The congregation began arriving at 9:30. They came the way they always came, in families and pairs and alone, filling the pews from the front as they had learned to do over the decades, because I had always preached the same instruction, come close. You will hear better. The Hendersons took the 4th pew on the right. 3 generations of them arranged in order of height, the way they had always sat. Brother Timmons came in slowly with his cane and took his place at the piano bench, and ran his stiffened hands across the keys in a quiet warm-up that had no particular melody but felt like a greeting. The women from the Thursday prayer group sat together on the left side, 7 of them, in the coats they wore to church. They had been meeting in the fellowship hall for 22 years. Some of them had come through things that would have broken a person with less foundation under them. 200 people. The church was full. Rose came in at 9:50 and took the last pew on the right. She had a small bag at her feet. Cross arrived at 10 minutes before 11. The arrival time of a man who expects to be received and does not concern himself with the ordinary logistics of getting to church on time. He came with a single assistant, carrying a leather portfolio. Cross was dressed well, as he always was. He looked around the sanctuary the way a man looks at something he has already decided to take. He took the seat in the front row that Jimmy directed him to. Terrence and Camille came in together. Terrence was wearing his pastoral collar and a gray suit. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some time. Camille wore a dark dress and moved with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to make displacement look like purpose. They sat beside Cross. I watched all of this from the small room off the side of the sanctuary, where I had always gone to collect myself before a service. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see the pews filling and the morning light coming through Gloria's stained glass. At 11 o'clock, I walked out. The congregation settled as I made my way up the center aisle. Some of them knew something was different. You cannot pastor a congregation for 46 years without them learning to read you. They saw the suit, and they saw something in the way I was walking, and they paid attention. I stood at the pulpit and looked out at the room. I began where I had always begun, with gratitude. I thanked them for coming. I spoke about what the building had meant over the decades, the baptisms and funerals and ordinary Sundays that made up the architecture of a life lived in community. I kept my voice warm and my pace slow, building ground before building argument. I spoke for about 7 minutes in this way. Then I paused. I looked at the front row. Cross was watching me with the comfortable attention of a man at a pleasant formality. Terrence was looking at his hands. When I spoke again, something had changed in my voice. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. Brothers and sisters, I said, I have been a pastor long enough to know that there are different kinds of thieves in this world. Some of them come in the night with tools, and some of them come on Sunday morning in a good suit and shake your hand at the door. I let that sit for a moment. The thieves I am speaking of today, I said, are sitting in the front row. The silence that followed was absolute, and every eye in that sanctuary turned toward the front of the room. Cross did not move at first. He simply looked at me with the expression of a man who has heard an impertinent remark and is deciding whether it warrants his attention. Reverend Jenkins, he said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. I have had enough private conversations, I said. This congregation deserves a public one. I turned back to the pews. 3 weeks ago, I said, my son called me at midnight with a story about a fire in this building. There was no fire. He needed me away from the church so that 2 men could enter this office in the middle of the night and remove documents. Documents that would show what had been done to this congregation without your knowledge or consent. The room shifted. 200 people paying a different kind of attention. I described the filing cabinet, the forged board meeting minutes with my name on them, the date, the 14th of February, when I had been lying in a hospital bed and could not have signed anything. I described the county transfer notice that arrived in my mailbox. I described my son's silence and his lies, and the morning I found $50,000 missing from the retirement account his mother and I had spent 30 years building. I kept my eyes on the congregation, not on Terrence. Cross stood up. "This is defamatory," he said, his voice now carrying an edge. "Reverend Jenkins, I would strongly advise you to stop speaking." From the side of the room, Jimmy Holloway stood up. 3 of the older deacons stood as well, without prompting, the way men of a certain generation stand when something is happening that needs witnessing. "Sit down, please," Jimmy said to Cross. His voice was completely calm. He was 71 years old, and he had a piece of shrapnel in his hip from Vietnam, and he was not going to sit down, and he was not going to be the one who moved first. Cross looked at Jimmy for a long moment. Then he sat down. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I had the audio file queued. I pressed play and held the phone toward the microphone Rose had mounted to the pulpit lectern before the service. Raymond Cross's voice filled the sanctuary. "These old Negro congregations," the recording said, in the tone of a man in a private room. "They don't know what their land is worth. Never did. You go in there with the right language, the right promises about ministry and legacy and carrying on the mission, and they hand you the keys, every single time." I let it play until the part where Cross said, "He takes the fall. That is what he is there for." Then I stopped it. The silence in the church was different now. It was the silence of 200 people who have just heard something they cannot unhear. I could see it in the faces in front of me, the particular expression that comes when a person understands that a wrong was done to them specifically, not in the abstract, but to them, in their church, in their community, to people they loved. Cross's face had gone very still. I reached into my other pocket and took out a single page. It was not the full letter. It was the last paragraph, copied in my own hand that morning before I dressed. "My wife wrote this," I said. "A month before she died." I read it aloud. I read about Gloria seeing the men with clipboards on the sidewalk and doing her research quietly, without alarm, because she was a woman who acted on what she knew rather than what she feared. I read about the 14 months of the National Register application and the 8 months of the trust document. I read her final line, "Keep preaching. Walter, I am listening." A woman in the third pew began to cry, then a second, then more. I folded the page and put it back in my pocket. Gloria Jenkins transferred this church, this land, and this building into an irrevocable community heritage trust before she passed. I said, "It is registered with the federal government. It is entered on the National Register of Historic Places. No private sale, no county transfer, no partnership agreement signed by any individual has legal standing against that trust. Every document Raymond Cross filed with Shelby County to take this property is void." Cross was on his feet again. That is not possible," he said. His voice had lost the smooth authority entirely. What was underneath it was harder and less practiced. "The county verified the transfer. The title is clear. The county verified a forged signature on a document that preceded my wife's trust registration by 2 years," I said. "They will be reviewing that carefully." The rear doors of the church opened. 4 people in dark jackets came through them. The letters on the back were yellow and plain. They walk down the center aisle with the particular unhurried purpose of people who have legal authority and know it. Cross turned and saw them coming. I had imagined a man like Cross facing this moment with his composure intact, controlling the narrative to the last. What I saw instead was a man who had built his entire life on being believed, standing in a church he had tried to steal, watching that structure dismantle itself in real time. The agents were professional and thorough. They were not unnecessarily rough, and they were not unnecessarily gentle. They were doing a job. When the handcuffs closed around Raymond Cross's wrists, he was standing directly beneath the stained glass windows that Gloria had designed. The morning light came through the river and the cottonwood trees and fell across his shoulders in blue and pale gold. I watched it happen. And then I looked down at my son sitting in the front pew, and I understood that the hardest part of this day had not yet arrived. Camille was the first one to leave. She did not leave the way people leave when they are upset or overwhelmed. She did not rush. She did not cry. She stood from the front pew with the same measured composure she had brought into every room I had ever seen her enter, straightened the front of her dress, and reached down to the ring on her left hand. She turned it once, slowly, and slid it off. She set it on the wooden pew beside Terrence's knee. She did not look at him. She picked up her coat from where it had been folded across the armrest, draped it over her arm, and walked up the center aisle toward the rear doors. Her heels were quiet on the carpet. The doors opened and closed behind her. Terrence did not watch her go. He was looking at the ring on the pew beside him. The congregation filed out slowly after that. They were not the way people sometimes are after a service, talking in the aisles, moving in no particular hurry. They moved the way people move after something irreversible has happened, with the subdued and careful manner of those who have witnessed something they will be thinking about for a long time. Some of them touched my arm as they passed the front of the sanctuary. Some of them said nothing at all. The Henderson family filed past in their row without speaking, the grandmother's hand on her daughter's shoulder. Brother Timmons was the last of the congregation to leave. He closed the piano quietly when he rose, the way he always did, and walked slowly up the aisle. At the end of the front pew, he paused. He looked at Terrence for a moment, and then he looked at me. He gave a small nod, the kind that contains an entire sentence. And then he walked out. The federal agents finished their work and left. They were courteous and efficient, the way professionals are when they have done a job correctly and have no need to announce it. Rose stopped beside me on her way out and put a hand briefly on my shoulder. She did not say anything. She understood the situation well enough to know that what came next required privacy. Jimmy locked the rear doors from the inside and went out through the side entrance, leaving me the key on the front pew. The sound of the latch clicking was very loud in the empty room, and then it was just the two of us. Terrence was still sitting where he had been. He had not moved since Camille left. The ring was still on the pew beside him. He was not looking at anything in particular. He looked like a man who had come to a place very far from where he had started, and was only now beginning to understand the distance. I came down from the pulpit and walked up the center aisle. I did not sit across from him. I sat down beside him, on his right side, leaving one pew's width of space between us, the way I had sat beside him in this same row 40 years ago when he was 4 years old and could not yet reach the hymnal holder in front of him. We sat for a while without speaking. Outside, I could hear the parking lot emptying, car doors and engines and the ordinary sounds of people returning to their Sunday afternoons. Eventually, those sounds faded too, and there was nothing but the building settling in the cold air. "I knew it was wrong," Terence said. His voice was quiet and rough in the way of a person who has been holding something back for a long time and has finally put it down. "Not the way I know things are wrong in theory," he said. "I knew it the way you know when you are doing something you cannot undo, and I kept going anyway. I did not respond. I let him speak. I told myself it was about the church, that the church needed resources, needed to grow, needed what Cross was offering. I believed some of that for a while. Cross is convincing. He knows exactly what to say to a man who wants to be more than he is." He paused. "But that was not why I did it. Not really." He looked down at his hands. "I have been preaching from your pulpit for 3 years," he said. "Every Sunday. People come in and they look at me and they see you. They tell me I remind them of you. They say how proud you must be. They ask how it feels to carry on your legacy." His voice was steady, but there was something in it that had been in it for a long time without me hearing it. "I have never once, in 3 years, preached a sermon that was about me. It has always been about you, your church, your legacy, your name on the building." He was quiet for a moment. "Cross told me I could build something of my own. He said the old structures had to come down before anything new could grow. He made it sound like vision, like courage." He exhaled slowly. Camille believed every word. "I think I needed someone to believe it so I could." I looked at the stained glass. The afternoon light had shifted, and the colors were deeper now. The blue of the river turning toward indigo. I sat with what he had said. There was truth in it. There was also an accounting that had not yet been done. The two things lived in the same space, and I was not going to collapse one into the other. I wanted to forgive him. The part of me that had held him as a newborn and taught him to ride a bicycle on this street and sat with him through his mother's last days wanted nothing in the world more than to reach across and tell him it would be all right. But some fractures run too deep for words, and both of us knew it. After a while, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I had put the envelope there that morning before I left the house. The same way I had put everything else in its place that morning with deliberate care. It was a plain white envelope, unsealed. I set it on the pew between us. Terence looked at it without touching it. There is enough there for an initial consultation with a criminal defense attorney. I said, "A good one. You are going to need one. You signed documents that are going to receive federal scrutiny, and Cross's lawyers will not be protecting your interests. You need someone who is..." He picked it up slowly. He held it with both hands and looked down at it, the way a person looks at something they do not feel they have earned. "Dad," he said. "I am not done," I said. He was quiet. "You are relieved of your pastoral duties at Calvary Road Missionary Baptist Church. Effective today." I kept my voice level. "The board will appoint someone interim while the congregation decides what comes next. That process will not involve me, and it will not involve you." The light through Gloria's stained glass had continued to shift through the afternoon. The blue of the river was a deep, fading color now, and the single light she had put above the water was still burning as clearly as it always had. A small warm point against the darkening glass. "I need you to hear something," I said. "What you did was wrong, not just legally, not just because of the money or the documents or what it cost this congregation. It was wrong because you looked at something your mother spent 46 years of her life building alongside me, and you decided it was a means to an end. You looked at the people in those pews, people who have known you since you were a child, and you treated them as an inconvenience in the way of something you wanted. I paused, and that is what I need you to sit with. Not the consequences, the choice. Terence did not respond. His eyes were on the floor in front of him. The consequences will happen whether you sit with the choice or not, I said. The federal process will go where it goes. But the man you are when it is over, that is the only thing you have any say in. He was quiet for a long time. Will I be allowed back here? He asked. His voice had gone small in a way I had not heard from him in 30 years. Not since he was a boy and had broken something in the house and was trying to understand whether the relationship between us had changed. To the church, I said. To you. I looked at the stained glass. I thought about what Gloria would say, not as a way of borrowing her words, but because she had known Terence longer than he had known himself, and she had a practice with people that I had always admired and never quite matched. She found the thing worth saving in a person and held on to that, even when the rest of the picture was difficult. She had brought Rose Parker home for dinner when Rose had nothing. She had believed in people at the exact point when believing in them cost something. She had also been honest. She had not confused kindness with the suspension of accountability. The door is open, I said. It has always been open, but you will have to walk through it on your own, Terence. Not because of what I need from you, because of what you need to become. I looked at him. That is not something that happens in a month. It is not something you can perform your way into. It is a long piece of work, and it has to be yours. He nodded slowly. He was not crying. I think he had gone past the place where crying was available to him. He looked the way a person looks when they have finally arrived at the real beginning of something very difficult. He reached over and picked up Camille's ring from the pew beside him. He held it for a moment, looking at it, and then he put it in his coat pocket without saying anything. I did not ask what he intended to do with it. That was his. He stood up. He looked at the stained glass one last time. A long look. The kind you give to something you are uncertain you will see again in the same way. The river, the cottonwood trees, the light above the water. Then he walked up the center aisle. At the rear doors, he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the door, and then he pushed it open and walked out into the late October afternoon. I listened to his footsteps on the porch steps. I heard his car start in the parking lot, the engine turning over in the cold air. I heard it pull out and drive away down Calvary Road until the sound was gone. The church was entirely quiet. I sat alone in the front pew for a long time with my hands in my lap, looking at the stained glass in the dimming afternoon light. The colors were going now, the richness of the midday giving way to something paler and thinner, the way all color does as the light moves on. I was not finished sitting yet. There was one more thing I needed to do, and I wanted to do it in this room, with what remained of the October light. I got up from the pew and walked to the pulpit. That was the one more thing. I had stood there earlier in the day before 200 people, and what I had said was true and necessary, and I do not regret a word of it. But I had not yet stood there alone, in the quiet, for myself. After 46 years of preaching to a room, I needed a moment to simply stand in the room without anyone needing anything from me. I climbed the 2 steps to the pulpit platform and placed my hands on the wooden lectern. The pews stretched out before me in the evening light, every one of them empty. I had stood in this spot and looked out at a full room so many times that the empty version had a weight of its own, the weight of all the Sundays that had been and were no longer. I walked down from the pulpit and moved slowly up the center aisle. I ran my hand along the backs of the pews as I went. The wood was smooth and dark from decades of hands. In the third pew on the left, the Henderson grandmother had sat for 31 years, first with her children on either side, and then with her grandchildren. And the wood at the end of that pew had a particular shine from her hand resting there each week. I stopped at the piano bench and put my hand on the lid the way Brother Timmons always left it, closed and ready for next Sunday. I kept walking until I reached the east wall. The stained glass was nearly dark now. The light outside had gone to the deep blue of early evening, and what remained in the glass was not the bright color of the midday service, but something quieter and more interior. The suggestion of the river and the trees rather than the thing itself. The single point of light above the water was the last thing to hold its color. The way a candle looks when the room around it goes dark. I stood in front of it for a long time. "You were right," I said, not loudly. The way you say something to a person who is standing close. About all of it. The preparation, the trust, the timing, all of it. The glass did not change. The light above the water held its small brightness. "I kept preaching," I said. "You told me to, and I did." I stood there until I felt whatever I had needed to feel in that moment. And then I turned around and faced the empty pews. I have spent my life trying to say true things from a pulpit. I have not always said them well, or said them with the courage the moment required. But I have kept at it, because the people in those pews deserved someone who kept at it even when it was difficult. Here is what I know. Standing in this building after everything that has happened, love is not the same thing as accommodation. Loving someone does not mean absorbing whatever they do to you without limit. It means telling the truth even when the truth is hard, and holding the line even when holding it costs you something you did not want to give up. I lost my son that afternoon in a particular way. The way you lose a version of a person when that version turns out to have been incomplete. What I have now is something that might become something better. If Terrence is willing to do the work, the door is open. It is genuinely open. That is not a performance. Faith is not passive. I learned this from my wife more clearly than I learned it from any text. Gloria did not sit and wait for the threat to pass. She studied it. She prepared for it. She built the legal instruments to counter it while she still had time, quietly and without alarm, because she understood that the work was more important than the appearance of the work. The most powerful act of protection she ever performed. She performed in silence, over years, and I did not know about it until 4 years after her death. That is what faith in action looks like. Not the dramatic gesture, the patient preparation, the quiet act of care that will not be seen until it is needed. And this, the most important thing I know from these weeks. A man's dignity is not given to him by others. It cannot be taken by others. Not really. Not if he does not hand it over himself. Cross looked at me across that desk in Germantown, and he saw a tired old man from a neighborhood he would not have lived in, carrying a history he would have bulldozed for a parking structure. He thought he understood what I was. He was wrong. because he was looking at the outside of a thing and calling it the whole thing. The church is still standing. I turned off the lights one by one, the way I have done at the end of every service for 46 years. The nave went dark. The fellowship hall went dark. The entry lamp went dark. I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. Then I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The Memphis sky was cold and enormous and full of stars. The kind of sky that only comes in October when the heat has finally let go. The air smelled like fallen leaves and wood smoke, and the particular clean smell of a city at night. I stood on the porch of my church and looked up for a long moment. If you have ever stood your ground for something that mattered, even when standing felt impossible, I want to hear about it. Leave your story in the comments. That is where the real sermon continues. I looked back at the building one last time. The white steeple rose into the dark sky the way it had risen every night for 46 years. And it was there, and it was not going anywhere. The church was still standing, and so was I.